By the summer of 1945, Japan had already accepted something terrifying. Not defeat, not surrender, but invasion. They believed the Americans were coming, not just with soldiers, tanks, and bombers, but with fire so total that Japan itself would cease to exist. And when that moment came, the Japanese government made a decision unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. They would not rely on their army. They would not rely on their navy. They would turn schoolchildren, mothers, elderly men, and teenage girls into the final line of defense. This is the untold story of how Japan prepared its entire civilian population for a last stand against the United States, and how millions were trained not to survive, but to die. Japan's fear of an American invasion did not begin in 1945. It began years earlier, quietly, invisibly, inside war rooms, intelligence briefings, and the minds of Japan's military elite. By 1943, the war had already turned against Japan. Midway was lost. Guadalcanal was lost. The outer defensive ring of the Pacific was collapsing island by island. American aircraft carriers moved closer every month. American submarines strangled Japan's supply lines. American factories produced planes, ships, and weapons faster than Japan could replace losses. But the true terror was not defeat. It was what Americans represented. Japan's leadership believed the United States would not merely occupy Japan. They believed America would erase Japanese identity, destroy the emperor, and humiliate the nation forever. This fear was carefully cultivated. Military leaders, state media, and educators repeated a single message: if the Americans land, Japan ends. In late 1944, Japan formally embraced a concept called Kokumin Jiyutai, the National Volunteer Combat Force. On paper, it sounded patriotic. In reality, it meant something far darker. Every civilian between the ages of 15 and 60 was now considered a potential soldier. There would be no distinction between front line and home front. No difference between battlefield and village. Japan was preparing for Ketsugo, the decisive homeland battle. When American forces invaded Okinawa in April 1945, Japan watched closely. What happened there would define everything that followed. Civilians were not evacuated. They were mobilized. Schoolchildren served as medics. Teenagers carried ammunition. Entire families hid in caves, sometimes ordered to commit suicide rather than surrender. Japanese propaganda told civilians, "The Americans will torture you. They will kill your children. Death is preferable to capture." Over 100,000 civilians died on Okinawa. To Japan's leaders, this was not a tragedy. It was proof of concept. By early 1945, Japan no longer had enough rifles. So they improvised. What followed was one of the most disturbing civilian mobilization programs in history. Millions of civilians were issued bamboo spears. Not rifles. Not pistols. Sharpened sticks. Training manuals instructed civilians to aim for the abdomen, rush tanks in groups, attack soldiers during nighttime landings, accept death as success. Schoolgirls practiced lunging motions in schoolyards. Elderly men drilled with wooden rifles. Children were taught where to stab an American soldier to ensure fatal bleeding. This was not symbolic training. It was literal. Women were given a special task. They were trained to hide grenades in clothing, approach wounded soldiers, detonate at close range. Mothers were told to kill their children first, so they would not fall into American hands. Government leaflets explained how to commit family suicide properly. The emperor's name was used to sanctify it. Classrooms were converted into training halls. Math lessons were replaced with bayonet drills, grenade-throwing practice, marching and chanting death oaths. Children memorized slogans like 100 million deaths for the emperor. Education had ended. Preparation for death had begun. By 1945, Japan did not fear American weapons alone. They feared Americans themselves. This fear did not emerge naturally. It was designed, carefully, deliberately, and relentlessly by the Japanese state. Before civilians could be ordered to die, they first had to believe that living under American control was worse than death. And so, Japan began one of the most intense civilian propaganda campaigns in modern history. To Japan's wartime government, the American soldier could not be human. A human enemy might inspire sympathy. A human enemy might invite surrender. So the American was transformed into something else. Posters depicted U.S. soldiers as gigantic beasts with fangs, apes with blood-soaked hands, monsters drooling over Japanese women and children. American faces were exaggerated, wide mouths, hollow eyes, grotesque expressions. The message was simple and constant. These are not men. They are animals. Schools taught children that American soldiers raped every woman they encountered, murdered infants for sport, cut off body parts as trophies. None of this required evidence. Repetition made it real. Teachers read government-issued pamphlets aloud to classrooms, describing imaginary massacres in vivid detail. Children went home terrified, not of bombs but of capture. Parents were told, if you surrender, your family will suffer unspeakable humiliation. Fear became discipline. Film was one of Japan's most powerful tools. Government-approved movies showed American soldiers laughing as villages burned. Captured Japanese women were portrayed begging for death rather than being defiled. In every scene, the Americans smiled. Enjoyment of cruelty was their defining trait. The audience never saw mercy, never saw restraint, never saw complexity. Cinema taught civilians how to imagine the future, and the future was unbearable. Psychologically, propaganda served a deeper purpose. It removed moral hesitation. If the enemy was a monster, then killing, even suicide, became righteous. If surrender meant torture, then resistance became mercy. Civilians were told, to die is to protect your honor. To surrender is to betray your ancestors. This was not spontaneous nationalism. It was engineered obedience. The emperor never spoke directly to civilians about invasion, but his presence loomed everywhere. Posters implied his divine sorrow if Japan fell. Speeches invoked his eternal gaze. Training manuals linked civilian sacrifice to imperial loyalty. The unspoken equation was clear. Death equals loyalty. Survival equals shame. Even doubt became dangerous. Children were the most vulnerable and the most targeted. Textbooks described Americans as historically cruel and spiritually empty. Songs taught in schools included lyrics about stabbing invaders. Playtime games were redesigned to simulate ambushes and attacks. By the time invasion training began, many children were already convinced. If the Americans come, we must die. Fear had replaced childhood. Not all propaganda was official. The government encouraged rumors. Stories spread of Okinawan girls allegedly abused after capture, stories often invented or exaggerated beyond recognition. These rumors traveled faster than leaflets. They reached villages untouched by bombings. And they worked. Civilians began preparing suicide tools, ropes, poison, blades, long before any American landed. Some Japanese citizens had doubts. They had heard whispers from prisoners of war from shortwave radios that Americans were not monsters. Those whispers were crushed. Listening to enemy broadcasts was punishable by arrest. Speaking positively of Americans was considered treason. Truth became illegal. By mid-1945, propaganda had achieved its final goal. Civilians no longer needed orders. They were already convinced that resistance was mandatory. Death was honorable. Surrender was evil. This mental state was essential. Because the next step, arming civilians with bamboo spears and grenades, would only work if fear had already won. And it had. By the spring of 1945, Japan was no longer asking if the Americans would invade. The only remaining question was where. Japan's military planners believed the future was already written. American troops would land on the beaches. Japanese civilians would rise from villages and cities. And the homeland would become a battlefield so costly that the United States would hesitate to continue. This belief formed the foundation of Operation Ketsugo, Japan's final plan for survival. Operation Ketsugo was built on a single assumption: that American political will could be broken. Japanese strategists understood they could not defeat the United States militarily. They could not outproduce American factories. They could not replace lost pilots or ships. But they believed America feared casualties. If enough Americans died on Japanese soil, public opinion would force Washington to negotiate. The solution was mass sacrifice. Not just soldiers. Everyone. Japan expected the first invasion at Kyushu, the southernmost home island. American reconnaissance made the conclusion unavoidable. So Japan turned Kyushu into a death trap. Coastal cliffs were fortified. Beaches were mined. Hills were honeycombed with tunnels. Villages were prepositioned as ambush zones. But the most important weapon was not concrete or steel. It was people. Civilians were not trained to fight battles. They were trained to die efficiently. Instruction manuals outlined tactics such as attacking landing troops during confusion, swarming isolated soldiers, forcing Americans to shoot civilians, increasing psychological strain, continuing attacks even when wounded. Civilians were told, your role is to delay, confuse, and bleed the enemy. Survival was irrelevant. Operation Ketsugo officially incorporated suicide tactics. Civilians were instructed to throw themselves under tanks with explosives, charge machine gun nests to draw fire, detonate grenades at point-blank range. Even failure was considered success. A single American bullet spent on a civilian was counted as victory. The plan made no exemptions. Teenage girls were assigned to close combat sabotage. Children were tasked with carrying messages, leading troops into ambush zones, distracting soldiers. Elderly men were positioned near beaches to trigger early contact. This was not desperation. It was policy. Weapons shortages were severe. So Japan stockpiled bamboo spears, handmade grenades, Molotov cocktails, improvised explosives. Entire communities were issued identical tools of death. Training emphasized speed, surprise, and proximity. Close enough to smell the enemy. Japanese planners anticipated millions of civilian casualties. They accepted this. Internal documents projected 20–30% civilian mortality, massive urban destruction, long-term famine. These projections were not warnings. They were acceptable losses. The leadership believed Japan would emerge spiritually victorious, even if physically ruined. Across the Pacific, American planners prepared Operation Downfall. They predicted hundreds of thousands of U.S. casualties, extreme civilian resistance, prolonged urban combat. But even American estimates underestimated one thing: the degree to which civilians had been prepared to die. The emperor did not publicly endorse civilian sacrifice, but he did not forbid it. That silence was interpreted as approval. Military leaders framed Ketsugo as the emperor's unspoken will. For civilians, this was enough. Operation Ketsugo depended on a fragile belief that sacrifice alone could overcome industrial power, that fear could defeat logistics, that bodies could replace ammunition. History had already answered this question elsewhere. But Japan refused to listen. The plan spoke in numbers, percentages, casualty estimates, acceptable losses. But for the civilians of Japan, the war was not a strategy. It was hunger. It was fear. It was waiting every morning for an invasion that might arrive before sunset. And that waiting slowly destroyed them. By mid-1945, daily life in Japan no longer resembled peace or even war. It resembled rehearsal for death. Villagers woke before dawn for drills. Students lined up in schoolyards not for lessons, but for bayonet practice. Factories trained workers to fight at night after long shifts. Every sound from the sky caused panic. Every rumor triggered fear. There was no escape. Food shortages were severe. Rice was rationed to near starvation levels. Children fainted during drills. Elderly civilians collapsed while digging trenches. Yet training continued. The logic was simple. You will not need food when the Americans arrive. Starvation was reframed as preparation. Some civilians wrote, not publicly, not for history, but because writing was the only place fear could exist safely. A schoolgirl in Kyushu wrote, "We are told we must stab the enemy. But I am afraid. I do not want to die. Is that shameful?" An elderly farmer wrote, "They gave me a spear. My hands shake too much to hold it. I think they want me to die quickly." These words were never meant to survive. But some did. Children were told they were warriors. But they were still children. They cried during drills. They asked questions teachers could not answer. Some practiced stabbing sacks of straw and then cried afterward. Others became frighteningly quiet. Fear matured them too fast. In many homes, parents hid children during training, not to protect them from Americans, but from their own government. Mothers were taught something worse than combat. They were taught what to do if capture became inevitable. Government pamphlets explained how to suffocate infants quietly, how to poison children before oneself, how to maintain dignity in death. Some mothers practiced these instructions in silence, not because they believed them, but because refusal felt impossible. Quiet resistance. Not everyone believed. Some hid weapons. Some skipped drills. Some whispered that Americans might not be monsters. But resistance had limits. Surveillance was constant. Neighbors reported neighbors. Fear of punishment often outweighed fear of invasion. Silence became survival. By late summer 1945, exhaustion had set in. People stopped reacting to air raid sirens. Some civilians hoped for invasion, anything to end the waiting. Others prayed for death without invasion. Mental breakdowns were common but unrecorded. There were no hospitals for despair. Survivors from Okinawa told stories. Some confirmed the propaganda. Others quietly contradicted it. They spoke of American soldiers giving food, treating wounds, showing restraint. These stories spread cautiously. They created confusion, and confusion was dangerous. By the time atomic weapons were used, Japan's civilians were already broken. Not physically defeated, but psychologically spent. They had been trained to die for months, some for years. And when death finally came from the sky, many felt only numbness. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Japan was still preparing for invasion. Civilians were drilling. Weapons were being distributed. Orders were being repeated. Then, without warning, the future disappeared. At 8:15 a.m. over Hiroshima, the sky exploded. There was no warning siren. No approaching aircraft formation. No time to react. Just a flash. Those close enough never heard anything. Those farther away felt heat like the sun had fallen. Entire neighborhoods vanished in seconds. For many survivors, the experience felt unreal, like time had stopped and restarted wrong. At first, no one knew what had happened. There was no word for it. Military officials assumed it was a new type of bomb, but not a decisive one. Some believed invasion was still imminent. Civil defense units were ordered to maintain readiness. Civilians were told, "The enemy will land soon. Do not lose resolve." Even Hiroshima did not immediately end Ketsugo. 3 days later, the same light appeared again. This time over Nagasaki. Now there could be no doubt. Something fundamental had changed. But even then, the machinery of sacrifice continued. Weapons were not collected. Drills were not canceled. Propaganda did not stop. Japan stood between two realities, destruction and denial. On August 15, the impossible happened. For the first time in history, the emperor addressed the nation directly. His voice, soft, distant, almost unreal, filled radios across Japan. He did not use the word surrender. But everyone understood. The war was over. Across the country, civilians reacted in silence. Some cried. Some laughed. Some felt nothing at all. Many did not know what to do. They had trained for death, not for peace. Weapons lay unused. Suicide tools were hidden or destroyed. And a question echoed everywhere. If we were not meant to die, why were we taught how? Local commanders hesitated. Some refused to accept the broadcast. In isolated areas, civilians remained armed for days. A few deaths occurred after surrender, through confusion, fear, or habit. The machinery of sacrifice could not stop instantly. It had momentum. Civilians slowly realized something horrifying. Their deaths had been planned, not as tragedy, but as strategy. They were meant to die not to win, but to influence negotiations. This realization would haunt survivors for decades. When American troops finally landed, not as invaders but occupiers, they encountered something unexpected. There was no mass uprising, no bamboo spear charges, no civilian ambushes. There was exhaustion, hunger, and quiet relief. The monsters from propaganda did not behave like monsters. That contradiction shattered years of conditioning. Survivors struggled to process what had happened. They had lived months believing death was mandatory. Now they were told to live. There was no ceremony for that transition. No counseling. No apology. Only silence. The war had ended. The invasion never came. But Japan's experiment with civilian sacrifice had already left scars deeper than any battlefield could. When American occupation forces arrived in late 1945, they encountered a nation unlike any they had anticipated. Schools had bayonets and bamboo spears stored in closets. Villages had hidden grenades. Manuals detailing suicide tactics lay forgotten in attics. Military officers proudly showed occupiers the maps of civilian defensive positions, roads, tunnels, ambush points. Yet no civilian uprising occurred. The Americans realized Japan had trained its population for death. But the war had ended before the plan could be tested. U.S. military historians were stunned. They had anticipated fighting a battle unlike any other in history. Entirely civilian-based resistance, meticulously organized, prepared to die. Yet when they arrived, they found only survival and exhaustion. The contrast between expectation and reality created a paradox. How could a nation prepare for such mass sacrifice and then survive untested? For Japanese civilians, the psychological toll persisted. Survivors carried years of fear, hunger, and drills, even without casualties from invasion. Children who trained with bayonets remembered them like nightmares. Mothers who prepared poisons and ropes could not forget the instructions. Entire villages had rehearsed death, only to discover life was suddenly expected. Generations were shaped not just by war, but by the anticipation of death. Post-war Japan faced another challenge: memory. The government, pressured to rebuild, did not publicly discuss civilian militarization. School curriculums were sanitized. Propaganda manuals were destroyed. Books were rewritten to focus on surrender and peace. Millions of civilian deaths planned, but never carried out, quietly vanished from collective memory. Yet for those who lived through the drills, the bamboo spears, and the mental conditioning, the experience remained vivid. What history records rarely includes the preparation, the fear, and the manipulation. Japan's civilian training shows governments can weaponize fear and loyalty. Entire populations can be conditioned for death. Propaganda can create obedience more lethal than weapons. It is a warning. Even without bombs or bullets, ordinary people can become instruments of war. Looking back, historians and psychologists ask, how close did Japan come to turning its entire population into expendable soldiers? What would have happened if Operation Downfall had begun? How would children, mothers, and the elderly have fared against industrialized assault? No one knows exactly. The answer lies in what didn't happen: an invasion prevented, a nation spared, and lives that, against all expectation, survived. Japan trained millions to die. It armed them with fear, weapons, and ideology. It expected the ultimate test, the slaughter of civilians, to stop an invasion. But the test never came. And yet the lesson remains. Fear can be engineered. Sacrifice can be demanded. And even when death is avoided, its shadow can shape generations. History remembers the bombs, but it should also remember the preparation for them. Because in the quiet towns, the schoolyards, and the hidden caves of 1945 Japan, an entire nation rehearsed for extinction. And that rehearsal, though untested, was as real as any battlefield.